story one lost in the desert. Tom had always been fascinated by the vast, barren landscapes of the American Southwest. There was something about the endless stretches of sand, the towering mesas, and the complete isolation that called to him. So when he finally got the chance to take a solo road trip through the desert, he jumped at it. Armed with nothing but his car, a few supplies, and a GPS, he set out on what he hoped would be the adventure of a lifetime. The first few days went smoothly. Tom visited all the major tourist spots, took stunning photos of the desert at sunrise and sunset, and marveled at the raw beauty of the landscape. But on the fourth day, he decided to venture off the beaten path. He wanted to experience the true isolation of the desert, to be completely alone with nothing but nature around him. So he ignored the main roads and took a dirt track that seemed to lead deeper into the wilderness. At first, the drive was exhilarating. The dirt track wound its way through narrow canyons and across wide open plains with no signs of civilization anywhere. Tom felt a thrill at being so far from anyone and anything. But as the hours passed and the track became rougher and harder to follow, he began to feel uneasy. His GPS was no longer picking up a signal, and the dirt track had all but disappeared. It was just him, his car, and the vast emptiness of the desert. Tom tried to retrace his steps, but everything looked the same. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the desert floor, and he realized with growing panic that he was lost. He drove in what he hoped was the right direction, but after hours of fruitless searching, he was no closer to finding his way back. The desert was a maze of canyons and ridges, and he had no idea where he was. As night fell, Tom's situation grew more desperate. His car was running low on gas, and he was miles from anywhere. The temperature plummeted, and he shivered in the cold, dark desert. He tried to stay calm, telling himself that he would find his way in the morning, but the isolation was getting to him. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional howl of a distant coyote. Every rustle of the wind, every creak of the car made his heart race. Tom spent the night in his car, unable to sleep. He felt exposed and vulnerable in the middle of nowhere with no one to help him. When the first light of dawn appeared, he was relieved, but his relief was short-lived. The desert looked even more desolate in the harsh morning light, and he still had no idea where he was. He decided to abandon his car and set out on foot, hoping to find a road or some sign of civilization. He took only the essentials: water, a flashlight, and his phone, though he knew it was useless without a signal. He walked for hours, the sun beating down on him, but the landscape never changed. It was just more sand, more rocks, more emptiness. Tom began to feel the effects of dehydration and exhaustion. His steps grew slower, his vision blurred, and he felt dizzy and disoriented. But he forced himself to keep going, driven by the fear that if he stopped, he would never get up again. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, though he knew it was impossible. There was no one out here, just him and the desert. As the day wore on, Tom's situation became more dire. He had run out of water, and his legs felt like lead. He knew he needed to find shelter before nightfall, but there was nothing around. Just when he was about to give up, he saw something in the distance, a small, dilapidated shack. He wasn't sure if it was real or a mirage, but he had no other options. Tom stumbled toward the shack, his heart pounding. When he reached it, he found the door hanging off its hinges. Inside, it was dark and musty, with broken furniture and debris scattered everywhere. But it was shelter, and that was all he cared about. He collapsed on the floor, too exhausted to care about the dust and dirt. As he lay there, struggling to catch his breath, Tom thought he heard something. A faint rustling sound, like someone moving in the shadows. He sat up, his heart racing, but he saw nothing. He told himself it was just his imagination, but the sound came again, closer this time. Tom grabbed his flashlight and shone it around the room, but it revealed only the same broken furniture and debris. He was about to dismiss it as a trick of the wind when he heard it again, louder and more distinct, the sound of footsteps. Someone or something was in the shack with him. Tom's blood ran cold. He had thought he was alone out here, but now he wasn't so sure. He tried to convince himself it was just an animal, maybe a coyote that had found its way inside, but the footsteps were too deliberate, too human. They were slow and measured, as if whoever or whatever it was taking their time, savoring the moment. Tom's mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. He had heard stories of people who had gone mad in the desert, driven to madness by the isolation and the heat. Tom's flashlight flickered and went out, plunging him into darkness. He fumbled with it, trying to get it to work, but it was dead. The footsteps grew closer, and Tom felt a wave of panic. He had to get out of there, but he was too weak to move. He could only sit there paralyzed by fear as the footsteps stopped right in front of him. For a moment, There was nothing but silence. Then, a cold hand touched his shoulder, and Tom screamed. The last thing he remembered before everything went black was a low, rasping voice whispering in his ear. When Tom woke up, it was daylight, and he was lying on the ground outside the shack. His car was gone, and there was no sign of the shack or whoever or whatever had been inside. He was alone in the desert, with no memory of how he had gotten there. Dazed and confused, he stumbled toward the direction he thought was the road. Tom was found days later by a passing motorist, barely alive. He was dehydrated and delirious, mumbling incoherently about the shack and the footsteps. No one believed his story, dismissing it as the hallucinations of a man on the brink of death. But Tom knew what he had heard, what he had felt. The desert had taken something from him, something he could never get back. Story 2, The Vanishing Hitchhiker. Jenny and her friends had always been adventurous, the type who sought out thrills in the most unlikely of places. So when they decided to take a road trip through the remote back roads of the Appalachian Mountains, they were excited. The plan was to drive through the night, taking turns at the wheel and telling ghost stories to pass the time. The first few hours of the trip were uneventful. The road wound through dense forests, with only the headlights cutting through the darkness. The night was calm, the air cool, and the friends laughed and joked, their voices filling the small car. But as the night wore on, the road became narrower and more desolate. The trees closed in, and the only sound was the hum of the engine. It was around midnight when they saw her, a lone figure standing by the side of the road, her thumb outstretched in the universal gesture of a hitchhiker. She was young, maybe in her 20s, with long, dark hair that hung in damp strands around her face. She wore a simple white dress that looked out of place in the middle of nowhere. Jenny, who was driving, slowed down instinctively. Her friends protested, telling her it was too dangerous to pick up a hitchhiker in the middle of the night, especially in such a remote area. But something about the girl's forlorn expression tugged at Jenny's heartstrings. She couldn't leave her out there alone. Against her friends' wishes, Jenny pulled over, and the girl climbed into the back seat without a word. She sat there quietly, her hands clasped in her lap, staring straight ahead. Jenny tried to make conversation, asking where she was headed and if she was okay, but the girl only nodded or shook her head in response. There was something off about her, something Jenny couldn't quite put her finger on. She seemed distant, almost ethereal, as if she were only half present. But Jenny shrugged it off, chalking it up to the girl's obvious distress. They drove in silence for a while, the tension in the car thickening with each passing mile. It wasn't long before they reached a small, run-down motel on the outskirts of a tiny town. The girl suddenly spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, asking to be dropped off there. Jenny obliged, pulling into the gravel lot and stopping the car. The girl opened the door and stepped out, turning to thank Jenny with a sad smile before disappearing into the night. Jenny watched her go, feeling a strange sense of unease. Her friends urged her to leave, but Jenny hesitated. Something about the girl didn't sit right with her. She decided to go inside and make sure the girl was okay. Her friends groaned in protest, but eventually followed her. The motel was a dingy, run-down place with flickering neon lights and a peeling sign that read vacancy. The lobby was empty, save for an old man sitting behind the desk, reading a newspaper. Jenny approached him, asking if he had seen the girl who had just come in. The old man looked up, his brow furrowed in confusion. "No one came in here," he said gruffly, eyeing Jenny suspiciously. Jenny insisted, describing the girl in detail, but the old man only shook his head. He hadn't seen anyone, and there were no guests in the motel that night. Jenny's friends exchanged uneasy glances, urging her to leave, but Jenny was determined. She asked if she could look around just to be sure. The old man reluctantly agreed, and they searched the small motel from top to bottom. But there was no sign of the girl. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. Jenny felt a chill run down her spine. She knew what she had seen, and there was no way the girl could have just disappeared. Feeling unnerved, Jenny and her friends left the motel and drove back to the main road. The atmosphere in the car was tense, and no one spoke. As they drove, Jenny couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that the girl was still with them somehow.